Hello, this is Craig Camp at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. Welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into biodynamic and regenerative organic gold certified agriculture and winemaking. Often a visit to a winery can be a bit repetitive. There are rows of stainless steel tanks and pristine new oak barrels. After a few tours, they all start to look the same. But there are alternatives that can not only transform the look of your winery, but add complexity and authenticity to your wines. In biodynamic agriculture, intentionality is everything, and that extends to every aspect of winemaking, including the vessels you use to elevate your wines. On this episode of Troon Talk, we discussed with Troon Vineyard winemaker Nate Wall the complete array of alternative vessels he chooses to make our wines. Good morning, Nate. It's great to be back talking about cellar work again after several forays onto the farm. But it's a really interesting topic today, talking about alternative vessels. There's so many different vessels used today in winemaking, and we're using quite a few of them. So when it comes to winemaking, alternative vessels would seem to cover all containers besides oak barrels and stainless steel. While often presented as avant-garde, these other materials are ancient, often predating those materials by hundreds, if not thousands of years. What is it about these alternative vessels that have inspired you to move your winemaking in this direction?
Yeah, so I think it's no coincidence that the people who farm their vineyards organically and biodynamically are often the same people who look towards more natural methods of winemaking in the cellar. So when you're farming in a way that allows for the true expressions of both the grape and the place, as a winemaker, you want that purity to be appreciated in the finished wine. So our cellar practices are aimed at minimizing anything that might mask or diminish that purity, and this has inevitably led to the consideration of different types of vessels in the winery. As for calling these other vessels avant-garde or non-traditional, yes, it is interesting that stainless steel is now considered a traditional material for winemaking, since stainless steel tanks really didn't start being used in the wine industry until after World War II. So just 6 or 7 decades now, we have literally 8,000 years of winemaking history in other vessels. So we have evidence from the Republic of Georgia of the use of their clay kvevrey, buried underground. That was from around 6,000 BC. And these same vessels are still in use in Georgia today. Similarly, like amphora, that was used 3,500 BC in ancient Greece and all the way through probably 900 BC or later in ancient Rome. And then I guess concrete really didn't get much use in winemaking until this 19th century, but this still makes stainless steel for sure the new kid on the block when it comes to winemaking vessels.
Okay, so before we talk specifically about the alternatives we're using at Troon Vineyard, what are your thoughts on the pros and cons of stainless steel vessels in the winery?
Yeah, so stainless steel has some properties which does make it a great tool for modern winemaking, but it does have some downsides. For starters, stainless steel is absolutely inert, so the material does not react with the wine directly in a way that alters the wine's flavors, as opposed to, say, a toasted oak barrel, which absolutely influences the flavors. So that's a plus if you are looking for a vessel that doesn't obscure varietal characteristics. That's a plus in my book. Another strength, I guess the primary strength of stainless steel, and the reason, probably one of the largest reasons for its adoption, not just in winemaking, but in the food industry in general, is its cleanliness. It's one of the very few vessels that you could actually sterilize. You could hook up a steam generator and get it not just sanitary or clean for food production, but you could get it truly sterile. Most other vessels, particularly porous vessels, which we'll be talking about later, that becomes basically impossible, and it's not really necessary for what we're doing. But sterility in a vessel can be an advantage for some, particularly certain aspects of modern winemaking where the juice is also effectively sterilized, and then mass inoculation of a single strain of yeast that has been bred to produce a very certain flavor profile or added to sterile juice. So that is definitely not the way we operate at Troon, but that is common, especially in in larger industrial type wineries. So that is one reason that stainless steel is commonly used. But another interesting property of stainless steel is its high thermal conductivity, like the heat transfer. So this makes it very easy to control the wine temperatures during either fermentation or aging. You can just wrap the stainless steel tank in what's called a jacket, and then you can pump either hot or cold fluid through that jacket, and then the heat is transferred across the steel very readily. And so you can keep a tank at a very precise temperature. However, because of that same thermal conductivity, that means that those tanks are very sensitive to external temperature fluctuations as well. So this means that stainless steel tanks pretty much require ongoing temperature control all the time, unless you're in a very stable external environment like a barrel room or a cave that's kept at a very stable temperature. So because of that, stainless steel needs constant temperature control, which means that ensuing energy costs of heating and cooling and that carbon footprint, whereas that's not necessarily the case with some of the other vessels we'll probably talk about here. Another thing I wanted to point out, though, is that stainless steel is also completely impervious to gas transfer. So carbon dioxide from fermentation and oxygen from the air being the most relevant. The fact that the gas doesn't transfer across the steel can be beneficial in some places, but can cause some problems elsewhere. So we make one wine, our Glou Glou Grenache, and it uses a process called carbonic maceration. And this process, which is commonly associated with Beaujolais Nouveau style wines, those involve placing the whole grapes or the whole grape clusters inside a vessel that's completely devoid of oxygen. We use it by adding dry ice, CO2, and then you seal that vessel completely, preferably pressurizing it with carbon dioxide in some way. This allows the grapes to undergo an enzymatic reaction inside that tank, which converts sugars into alcohol inside the berries themselves. So this leads to like a fruitier wines with minimal tannins. It makes for a popular, easy drinking style of wine. But to make that style of wine, you need to be able to completely seal up a fermentation vessel that doesn't exchange gases. And so that's why we use stainless steel when making that wine. But however, being completely impervious to gas transfer does have downsides. And so other vessels will have like a micro-oxygenation that occurs through, like, as oxygen kind of slowly enters through the pores of a vessel, and that over time can help like soften a wine. It can help prevent some what winemakers call reductive or kind of stinky or off aromas from forming, and that micro-oxygenation can also help age the tannins of a wine, making the wine more drinkable younger. So stainless steel doesn't like do that at all, and so wines that are aged exclusively in stainless steel can sometimes seem like harder or like edgier, less rounded, and maybe like a little harsher or astringent, particularly in their youth, and especially red wines with a large amount of tannins. So lastly, though, and another reason that we do use stainless steel in our winery is that most of our stainless steel tanks are variable capacity. So that there's this little lid that you can just lower down on the tank until that lid is sitting directly on top of the wine. Then you just inflate a tube, which is basically like a big bike tire, and that seals around the lid. And so there's now zero like headspace in that container. So none of the wine is in contact with the air as it would be in a partially filled container. And what this does is it minimizes the risk of over-oxidation. You know, we're talking about micro-oxidation or micro-oxygenation, I should say, is good. You know, like an over-oxidation is bad. It can alter flavors. It can also lead to acetobacter, which is kind of the first step of the degradation process of the wine into vinegar. So we use the variable capacity tanks as our blending tanks when we put together finished wine a couple weeks before bottling. So this wine has fermented and aged in other vessels, but it only stays in the stainless steel tanks temporarily. And then being able to drop the lid on that wine and remove all the headspace is one way we're able to use very low levels of sulfur in our wine. So this is great. But yeah, a lot about stainless steel, but that's kind of like stainless steel in a nutshell.
Okay, well, how about the elephant in the room? Oak barrels.
Right, yes. So the use of oak barrels with wine, I looked this up because I was curious. It does date back to the Roman Empire. So 900 AD is how long wine has been being put in oak barrels. And it's basically because they were a lot less fragile and much easier to transport than the clay amphora, which had been used before that. And the Romans acquired this barrel technology from the Gauls, who were making barrels out of the most abundant material they had at their disposal, which happened to be what is now French oak. So ancient Gauls living in what is now France used what they had, and it happened to be their forests were French oak. And over time, as they mainly used these vessels for transportation, they noticed that wine that wasn't just transported, but also stored in these oak barrels had certain characteristics they liked. So the use of oak barrels of various sizes became relatively common in most parts of Europe. And thus the use of wooden barrels, which oak, but we'll also talk about other woods that you can make barrels out of that aren't oak. They truly are traditional in most winemaking regions. But what started happening in the 80s really reached, I guess it's hopefully zenith, maybe by the early aughts, was the overuse of like never before used, like newly toasted French oak barrels. So this practice of using a very large percentage of new oak, sometimes 100%, or I've even heard of like over 100%. There's actually people who will put their wine in 100% French oak barrels and then age them for a year, and then after a year rack them into 100% new French oak barrels again, brand new barrels. So you actually get like 200% French oak. So that sort of use of oak in winemaking, that is new, and that is associated with just dramatic changes to the flavor and the texture of wine. So I think it's that practice in particular that I think the pendulum's starting to swing back into balance there. But to talk about the vessels themselves, I mean, wood is a porous material. So this can breathe over time. So it does exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen through the wood. The process occurs most readily with newer barrels. So the newer the wood, the more open those pores. As the barrel gets used and reused, those pores start to get clogged with like lees and tartrates and things that do get, most of it are cleaned out between fills, but not completely. So that barrel slowly becomes less permeable to gas exchange as it ages. But the biggest impact that the barrel would have, I would argue, is that it's almost a byproduct of how those barrels are made, and that's the toasting. So when you think about wood, right? Wood is straight, but a barrel is rounded. So I guess it might surprise people to know that even today there's no glue or nails or anything that is used in the production of oak barrels for the wine industry. That is master craftsmen. The barrel makers are known as coopers, and they assemble those staves together almost like a three-dimensional puzzle. And they fit these together so perfectly that by the time they're done, those are watertight, and without anything between them. Just they do swell a little bit as they get liquid wine put into them, and that fully seals them up. But yeah, there's no glue or wood or nails or anything that keeps those barrels together. But to put them together, they have to take these straight boards, these straight staves, and then they use fire, heat, to make them more pliable. And then as they sit around the heat, you can start bending those staves inwards, and you drop a steel hoop around it and kind of bend them in a little more, drop another steel hoop. So you eventually get that barrel shape, but in that process, the flame is also toasting the wood itself, and that kind of results in the formation of different flavor compounds in the wood. So the wood, unlike stainless steel, wood is definitely not inert. So when the wine is stored in the barrels, those flavor compounds from the oak barrels and the toasting leach into the wine, altering the wine flavor. And over time, winemakers have realized that the way in which barrels were toasted during that shaping process affects the flavors it contributes to the wine. And nowadays, you can actually control, the exact temperature and the time of toasting can be very precisely controlled, and you can basically order barrels that specifically add certain flavors to wine. The amount of heat that a barrel gets at certain temperatures will actually create or release different compounds from the oak, which then leach into the wine. So you can basically add flavors to your wine that weren't there before. And these flavors can range from spices like cloves and cinnamon or baking spices, vanilla, caramel, toffee, like coconut. Then there's obviously the toasted or smoky flavors from the toasting itself, but this can also include like coffee and chocolate. And then there's also actual sugars involved in the toasting process. Basically, the toasting caramelizes, there's cellulose and hemicellulose are part of the wood, and when those sugars are toasted, they basically can become released into the wine. So anyway, the point here is that a judicious use of newer barrels can add flavors and textures to wine that many people appreciate. But to me, philosophically, if you're using oak barrels almost as an ingredient, you're adding a foreign flavor to a wine, almost like following a recipe. And particularly with a lighter bodied wine or a more nuanced wine, those added flavors can quickly overwhelm the actual intrinsic flavors of the wine themselves. And it kind of leads to an overly homogeneous or generic flavor profile just coming from the wood. If everyone orders the same barrels toasted the same way and those flavors end up in the wine, one wine's going to end up starting to taste pretty similarly to another wine if those flavors are totally overwhelming the wine itself. So, but regardless of how what the barrel starts with in terms of all those flavors, the amount of those flavor compounds entering the wine definitely diminishes over time. And then there are less and less of the flavors present each time you fill a barrel. So that's where the concept of this, quote, neutral oak comes in. That at some point a barrel is just deemed to be no longer contributing oak flavors to a wine, but it's just a storage vessel and is now neutral. But the exact point at which that occurs should be up for plenty of debate. There's this almost mythical concept in the wine industry that once a barrel has been used for 3 years, it's just magically neutral. And I can tell you that is demonstrably false. It's now the summer of 2023 when we are recording this, and in our cellar, our newest barrel, we have a single barrel from 2019. The remainder we have probably 350 or so barrels. So those are all 2018s down through maybe 2010, 2009. And that single 2019 barrel we have definitely is contributing some oak flavor compounds to the wine, even though it's now in its fourth year. So it has 2022 vintage wine in it right now. So that makes it 19, 20, 21, 22. So it's a fourth filled barrel. And even as we taste through these older barrels in our cellar, sixth, eighth fill, you'll come across some barrels that definitely taste surprisingly new despite their age. So, that's that concept of 3 years being neutral is definitely not accurate in my experience. But that is the reason why Troon tries to use truly neutral barrels in our barrel program. We do age much of our wine in barrels, but with the exception of that 2019, but even some of those others, we do use truly neutral barrels. And even though, in very small amounts, the flavors coming from the oak barrels, it's more like a seasoning, which could perhaps enhance certain flavors or aromas in the wine. But we prefer to have all of those flavors come from the grapes themselves and not get imported from the oak barrels. So that is, in a nutshell, like why Troon has been interested in these alternative fermentation and wine storage vessels to kind of back away from adding external flavors and really focus on the flavors in the grapes themselves.
Okay, so now for alternatives. Let's get more specific and start with amphora. As we've had the opportunity to work with them for a few years, where do we get our amphora? What inspired you to start working with them, and what has your experience been?
Yeah, so we were really excited to get our first 3 terracotta amphora here in time for our 2019 vintage. And since then, we've added some more, so we are now up to 7. 2 of them are extra large or XL amphora, and then 5, I guess, regular amphora, if there is such a thing. Our amphora are very, very cool that they're actually made right here in Oregon by a winemaker who is also a ceramicist, Andrew Beckham. The brand of his amphora is called Novum Ceramics, but Andrew and his wife Andrea also own and operate Beckham Estate Vineyard, which is up in the Chehalem Mountains in Willamette Valley, and that's also where the vessels are made. He has transformed part of his property into a studio capable with a kiln, especially capable of firing these very large vessels. And as far as I know, Andrew is the only producer of terracotta vessels for wine fermentation in North America. I mean, there's actually only a handful in the world, really. But I feel very lucky to have him and his pioneering vision here in Oregon. But I really started getting intrigued by the possibilities of terracotta or clay for fermentation and aging wine by stumbling across the wines of Grosvenor and Foradori, which in northeast Italy, and especially those Georgian wines. I mentioned the Georgian Kevevri, which are also terracotta, different shape, and those are buried in the ground, but kind of similar concept. And I also discovered these wines pretty much at the same time as I was getting into skin fermented white wines. So orange or amber wines is what we call them, the name for wine when you treat white grapes, basically like a red grape, ferment it on the skins to produce that orange color or amber color, as opposed to pressing it off and fermenting the juice as a white wine. But so a lot of the producers who use amphora, like Grosvenor and Foradori, also make amber wines. And so that's just, I kind of discovered that concept all at the same time. And to me, I guess as we start talking about these alternative vessels, what a recurring theme in the response will be is that it's all about the texture, right? Because these vessels aren't adding any flavors, which is part of the point of using them. And this is definitely the case with amphora. But different vessels can affect the texture of the wine in different ways without adding or taking away. And I think that's the appeal of these, like as an oak alternative, basically. Like oak, terracotta is generally also porous, but there's this huge range in that. Andrew, when he was kind of first discovering how to make these vessels, he's told me he had to experiment like a whole lot with not just the source material, so the clay, like where he was getting the clay from, what the characteristics of that clay was, but then like the firing times and the temperatures in his kiln, and like getting the right grouping of factors of that would create a finished vessel that had the amount of porosity that winemakers are looking for. So he tried a lot of different combinations to get basically to get it just right, because if it's too porous, the vessel will just start to weep wine like right out of the vessel. In particular, with terracotta especially, there seems to be like a wicking action almost, like especially if the outside temperature is like changing quickly, it'll almost like it'll want to wick wine through the vessel. So it has to be not porous enough to allow that to happen, but then you want the advantages that I described earlier, right, of having the gas exchange across the pores. So especially when used as a fermentation vessel, those vessels will be full of carbon dioxide as one of the byproducts of the yeast, making the alcohol from sugar. And you do want those to slowly degas over time. You don't want a carbonated wine necessarily. And so you want it porous enough for that to happen and get that like micro oxygenation, that small amount of oxygen coming into the vessel in a similar way to oak barrels. The terracotta does that as well, and that can help. Like we mentioned, it aids in the aging process of wine, particularly in the tannin development. But what I've found is these Novum ceramic terracotta amphora. I would say that the porosity there is slightly more than a new oak barrel, and those new oak barrels are of course slightly more than the neutral oak barrels that we use in our cellar. So that was definitely consideration in how we wanted to use these vessels, was that porosity. So it's because of that higher porosity that they have compared to pretty much anything else in our cellar. I knew that I didn't want to keep wine in them for much longer than about 10 months. But that works out great because it allows us to use the amphora, ferment in it, age the wine in that amphora, and then we empty it and bottle it after about 10, 11 months, which means that it's ready again for the next harvest. So that time frame seems to work really well. It works well for the wine, and it works well just as part of our annual cycle here of harvest and winemaking. And being able to use those amphora as much as possible.
The wine moves very differently in an amphora, right? Isn't that an important part of the textures?
It is, yeah. So an interesting, characteristic of clay is that clay has a net negative charge on it. It's unusual. Most things are not charged, but clay particles are. And many of the proteins that are found in wine, in the lees, for example, have a net positive charge. So what happens is you get the proteins are like electrostatically attracted to the inside of the amphora, and that leads to some really interesting interactions. So I guess first, if you think about a barrel, so there's a barrel laying on its side. In the cellar, and the lees, which are mainly dead yeast cells from fermentation, but also some tartrates typically, that settles down on the bottom of the barrel. So during the aging process, those lees can break down. They release compounds into the wine that generally add like a richness or a creaminess to the wine. But in a barrel, those have settled down to the bottom, and some winemakers choose to lees stir. It's called like batonnage, using a baton to basically open up the bung, put the baton in there, stir up the lees. It kind of kicks them up, and then they remain in suspension for a while, and that kind of helps with more contact of the wine with those lees. But in amphora, because of the charge of the clay, those lees aren't all down on the bottom. They're actually attracted like all around, so they're like kind of stuck all around that amphora, and it basically, instead of this like two-dimensional layer on the bottom, it's like this three-dimensional like hug that the amphora is just hugging the wine with lees from all sides, and that I think is in no small part that could lead to the greater texture in the mouthfeel that you get in wines coming from amphora. And this is all without ever having to open up the container to stir it, which means you're also not letting in oxygen. That batonnage process, that stirring process, is definitely like aerating the wine. And again, if you are trying to minimize your use of sulfur, one purpose of sulfur is to try to reduce oxidation in those wines, protect it against too much oxygen. Then opening up and stirring a barrel would require a little more sulfites in the wine to protect it from that basically aeration that you're also giving it. But amphora, that's not a risk. The amphora stays sealed, and you're still getting that kind of creaminess and texture coming from the lees. Another, I guess, component of amphora is that they seem to magnify or maybe elevate a sense of minerality in the wine. And so far, our experience at Troon, we've been using the amphora for skin fermented vermentino. So we're making, amber vermentino, and vermentino does naturally have a minerality to them. And when these amber wines are fermented and aged in amphora, that minerality seems to be more pronounced, like in a good way. I kind of doubt that amphora like magically gives minerality to a wine if it doesn't already possess that characteristic, but the amphora seems to really just help bring that out, or I guess focus that attribute in a wine that already has that minerality. But then, so orange wine with the vermentino is how we've been using most of our amphora so far. And an interesting concept there is that we're also able to leave those wines on their skins, on like full grapes. So we have 5 amphora that we utilize for making our amber vermentino, and in 3 of them we put whole berries, and in 2 of them we put about 50% whole clusters, so including the stems with the berries attached, and then we put the berries on top. And then we seal those up. They both ferment inside that amphora. We give them punch downs, literally punch downs, like by hand during fermentation. Just have the lid off, punch down, try to move the cap that forms, move that around, break that up, make sure that you're getting some oxygen in there during fermentation, which is when you want oxygen. But then when fermentation's over, we seal those up, we top them up with a little bit of vermentino from our other ferments, and then we leave them on their skins for that entire 10-11 month aging process. So that's what we use our smaller amphora for. But we do have these 2 extra large amphora. They're about 1.5 times, roughly, a little less the size, and those are currently filled with our estate Mourvedre. One of them actually has some Mourvedre Grenache co-ferment in, but I was thinking about that one because Mourvedre can have this pleasant earthiness to it, and I thought that kind of the terracotta amphora might be a good way of highlighting that kind of earthy character that Mourvedre can have. And Mourvedre also can tend towards reduction in the cellar. Like Syrah is famously reductive, and we have plenty of Syrah here, but Mourvedre does as well. So that porosity and that microoxygenation capacity of the amphora seems like a really good fit. We've got that experiment going right now, and it seems to be paying off. We hope to bottle that wine later this fall, so eventually you will be able to taste that yourself. But I guess the last thing I wanted to mention about amphora, especially some of these alternative vessels, but particularly this, is that there's just something distinctly satisfying about making wine in what is essentially like Bronze Age technology, right? Like, I'm a big fan of science and technology. I'm not a Luddite, but being able to not just make wine, but make clean wine and like compelling wine in the same way that this profession has been doing for literally thousands of years, that just links up with this. I mean, so much of what we're doing here, there's this primal energy to wine, and it's like, it really makes you think about like wine has been with humanity for thousands of years, and the fact that we can still make wine in the same way and just really show off what we're doing here is just, it makes me smile every time I see amphora standing in the cellar, because it just kind of links you to that long tradition that just we as a species have had with wine, and I just think that's a really neat aspect of a vessel like that.
One of the more interesting things, I think, in the amber amphora vermentino is that after 10 months, you've got whole cluster and whole berry in there, and you open it up after 10 months, and they're still intact.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird. Like those whole clusters, especially, it almost looks like they came from the grocery store. Some of those, it's like they could be fresh. It's because those are on the bottom, so there is a little bit of that. Kind of like I was talking about with the glue, there's a little bit of a carbonic maceration aspect occurring there, but especially as those vessels breathe over time, that CO2 does go out. But it's a pretty interesting thing, and I think Vermentino may be particularly well suited for it. because of the tannin qualities of the Vermentino, mean that even after 10 months on their skins, the Vermentino is not like bitter or harsh. Like the tannins that are getting extracted into that amber wine from the skins are just really balanced. You might think that something that was extracted, I'm sure every ounce of tannin after 10 months on the skins, might end up being harsh or astringent, but that is not the case. And I think the amphora probably play a pretty large role in that too.
Okay, so we're about to have a major change here at Troon Vineyard, and a significant number of concrete tanks will arrive shortly. You worked with one concrete egg last vintage making a Roussan. Why did you want to add concrete tanks to your palette of winemaking vessels? What was your experience with the one concrete egg last year, and how do you feel concrete will change the wines of Troon in the future?
Yeah, we're very excited to receive these concrete vessels. Should be arriving hopefully within the next month or so. And these are coming from Namblo. Namblo is kind of like the OG in terms of standalone concrete tanks for wine. In fact, Namblo was the first one to make like the concrete egg, which might be the way that most people are seeing concrete when they see it in pictures or in magazine articles. Would be this concrete egg, and that was interestingly enough, that was at the request of Chapoutier for Rhone wines. That was only in 2001, so I was kind of impressed to think about just how new a phenomenon this egg thing is. But concrete in general does have a relatively long history in the wine region, certainly longer than stainless steel. Wineries in Italy, or certainly like the Languedoc region in France, southern France, a lot of those wineries actually had these concrete vats poured, and then the winery was actually built around them. So in some of these older wineries, they're an immovable part of those wineries, and they were abandoned for a while as people thought they had to go on to do all this new oak, and that's the only way they were going to get good ratings and things like that. But they've uncovered and dusted off those concrete vessels and have started using them again, with pretty good results. But our first foray here at Troon was this egg-shaped vessel, and that is currently filled with our 2022 Roussan. And concrete does share a lot of similarities with the terracotta amphora that we were just talking about, but concrete is definitely its own thing. And I guess the first major difference is that concrete is heavy and it's thick. And we're talking like several inches thick here in terms of like the thickness of the walls. So this makes concrete pretty much the opposite of stainless steel in terms of like that thermal conductivity that we were talking about. So unlike stainless, which is very sensitive to external temperature fluctuations, it also is really good with temperature control because you can change its temperature so readily. Concrete is actually very insulating, and so this really limits the temperature swing in either direction. So during fermentation, what that means is like as the yeast start eating the sugar, they give off carbon dioxide. They also give off quite a bit of heat. And depending on your vessels, like certainly in stainless steel, then the heat will just spike. And so you could be going from 50 degrees all the way up to like 90 degrees or higher within a day, even in the case of like say Pinot Noir, like a very thin-skinned grape. You can just get a massive amount of heat occurring really quickly. But that doesn't happen in concrete. It's just slow and steady wins the race. The temperature just starts rising fairly slowly and steadily, and then it just holds this temperature. And like we found that to be like in the upper 60s actually. In most cases, a little lower even for our Roussan. I was like in the low 60s, and it just held that temperature throughout the entire ferment. And so that's a really nice fermentation curve for the yeast. Like if yeast get those heat spikes, they get stressed. When yeast get stressed, they can produce off aromas. You might end up with a very slow or sluggish or like stuck fermentation where it just doesn't want to finish because it's stressed itself out too much. But that doesn't really happen with concrete. So and then especially with the aging process in concrete, if wine is being able to, not just ferment, but age there, that insulation value is really nice in case there's external fluctuations in the cellar for some reason. You've got the door open because you have to move barrels in and out or something, and the temperature changes. That's just not enough to affect the concrete. The concrete just doesn't swing rapidly, so it's going to stay at a very stable temperature throughout its entire aging. But concrete then, like amphora, is also porous, or at least it can be. So that's actually the main reason we went with non-blow, because non-blow vessels are just concrete. There's no liners or any like chemical additives or anything. Some other concrete manufacturers have these proprietary blends, which they won't really tell you exactly what's in them. It does make them easier to clean oftentimes. Or they might have like a ceramic liner or something like that. But what that does is that dramatically affects the breathability of those tanks. So tanks like that still get that insulation, that thermal property that we were just talking about, but they do lose the breathability. So our non-blow tanks, the reason we're getting those is that they will breathe. And that's super important because outside of the egg that we have for Roussan, 4 of the 5 new tanks we're getting are going to be used for red wines, for both fermentation and aging of the red wines. And like I've mentioned before, we have a lot of varieties that we grow here that are on the reductive side of the spectrum. So Syrah and Mourvedre for sure. And so that micro-oxygenation aspect that porous vessels have is really useful for fermenting those kind of varieties, because that a little added oxygen can help offset that reductive tendency they have. So I guess another thing that comes up time and time again with concrete, and I think this is going to be even more true with our red ferments especially, but it's this concept of purity of fruit. And so that is the main draw for me to using concrete vessels, is that we think that the concrete should help us reveal like the purest, truest expression of many of the varieties we have here. So concrete seems to just be a really good fit with, going back to the vineyard and having the biodynamics, which really help to focus the terroir we have, like here right at our vineyard, help us express what's different here than anywhere else. Concrete not adding any flavors to get in the way of that, but then really just allowing like a purity of fruit and just, a purity of expression. That's what I'm really looking forward to, especially for those reds. But with going back to the egg thing too, so unlike the amphora, concrete isn't charged. And so that means that generally wines in concrete vessels will settle out really well, which could be a benefit. Especially for us, we don't fine or filter any of our wines. So having them settle out before bottling can lead to just nice clarity in the wines as they go into bottle. But there's something interesting about the actual shape of an egg that changes that. So the egg shape kind of encourages these natural like upwellings almost like inside the vessel. And so this wouldn't be true for other concrete vessels, but for that egg shape, we're also going to be getting a dolia, which is basically an upside down egg, and that does it similarly. But that egg shape kind of, it's almost like a very gentle lees stirring as well. So and that's part of the reason we put the Roussan in there, is that the Roussan is really high acid, and it's our Roussan this year is 11.5% alcohol. It's it's fairly modest sugars at harvest there, and by putting it in the egg, by having that kind of shape help with that lees stirring, basically that should add some nice kind of fleshiness to it, especially with that lower alcohol. Sometimes lower alcohol wines can maybe appear a little thinner on the palate, but with that additional lees contact, we're hoping that kind of really integrates with the wine to kind of build out a mid palate on that. But then you're still getting that purity of fruit from the concrete. So we think that should be a really good match with our Roussan, and it'll be cool to see how we end up using that concrete egg. Like, we'll probably evolve how we use it along with our evolving vineyard here. So to be determined.
So installing these new tanks is going to be quite the process.
Oh yeah. Yeah, a lot of these tanks weigh 4 tons or more empty, so 8,000 plus pounds. That is past the capacity of a regular forklift, and you get into the world of using cranes or these massive forklifts, and then trying to get these vessels through a door of a winery and get them positioned, because once they're positioned, they're never moving again. So yeah, it's going to be a process, but we've got our cellars ready. Locations are all set, and we're just excited to get them here, and we'll be getting them, in hopefully sometime mid-July. Will give us plenty of time to prepare them so they'll be ready for this coming harvest. Because that's actually something interesting. People ask about this, like concrete, that's like really basic, right? Like a high pH, how does that affect the wines? And there's actually a process that you do before you use them for the first time. Is you make a tartaric acid solution. So tartaric acid is the main acid found in wine, in grapes. There's also malic acid in grapes, which most of the malic acid gets converted to lactic acid during malolactic fermentation in the wine itself, but the tartaric stays. The tartaric is often what leads to the tartrates, sometimes little crystals that might form either in the bottom of a bottle of wine in the refrigerator, or sometimes on the bottom of a cork, those little crystals, that's tartrates. But anyways, so we use tartaric acid, which is the same acid that the grapes will have, when we do a rinse of those concrete tanks. And it's almost like seasoning a cast iron skillet, is kind of spraying that tartaric acid on the surface, and you do that like multiple times, just to kind of neutralize the surface of the concrete. Do it enough times so that it penetrates in about the same amount of that the wine will penetrate in. So you are trying to keep that vessel, even though concrete is a more basic, a more alkaline vessel, you're trying to neutralize that so that when the wine goes in there, it doesn't affect the acidity of the wine. And actually, the fact that I just brought up a cast iron skillet reminds me of something that Andrew Beckham was, who makes our amphora, was talking about. But part of the reason I think that some of these vessels aren't used as much, and one of the benefits I was mentioning of stainless steel is how easy they are to clean. Amphora and concrete are not as easy to clean, and neither is wood for that in that way. But with wood, you can actually use steam, because since wood is capable of swelling, it can move. It's not as fixed as the clay or the concrete. So you can use steam to clean those. But with the concrete and the amphora, you kind of have to take the same approach as you do when you're using cast iron in your kitchen, right? Like, you rinse it off, you get rid of all the food scraps, but it's clean, it's sanitary. But the process of cooking with cast iron also cleans it, right? In the same way that with concrete and amphora, you kind of need to be accepting of a certain amount of, a more casual approach to cleaning, in that you're never going to get those vessels totally clean. But that kind of goes back to one of our philosophies here, is that like we are not at war with our microbiology. Like everything we do out in the vineyard, especially with biodynamics, regenerative farming, it's really building these healthy, stable microbial populations in the soils, in the vineyard, on the grapes. When they come in, they have healthy bacteria on them. We're not as concerned about the presence of spoilage organisms, mainly because there's no room for those spoilage organisms to get a toehold in our ferments. So we've got it's I guess a lot of wineries that do kind of use that whole, hey, we add tons of sulfur at crush, we sterilize our juice, we only add this one yeast, we only want this one yeast and not a single other microorganism present, in our wine. They might be terrified of vessels that you can't sterilize, but so they miss out on a lot of the benefits of amphora and concrete because we're more understanding and more loving of our microbial friends. That technique works well for us, and it's similar to a cast iron skillet. The more you use them over time, like the better those vessels are known to get. So we're looking forward to continuing using these vessels in years to come.
Wood can be alternative too. We have 2 large oak foudres as well as some acacia barrels, which have an important role in your winemaking strategy. How do these fit into our winemaking program?
Yeah, so we've already discussed wood and oak in great detail, but we didn't really talk about the differences between like different types of wood or why that matters. So I guess first we can talk about oak again real quick. So French oak is kind of the international standard in terms of wood, both for barrels or for larger wooden objects. Like you mentioned, foudre. We have these, what are essentially a barrel standing on its head without a top. And it's just a large open top vat. That's foudre is just a generic term basically for a large wooden vessel that's not a barrel. The French oak thing started because that's what the Gauls had in France, and that's what they were using, and then people decided that they liked that, the characteristics that it provided. And what's interesting is even in French oak, and this is a total rabbit hole you can go down, but different forests grow differently. Basically, the trees respond to the climate around them, and depending on like how quickly it grows or the climate, it affects the growth rate of the tree, and then it affects like the grain of the wood, which ultimately affects the porosity of a barrel or a vessel made from that wood. French oak in general is pretty tight grained, so it's less porous than some others. But then these different forests in France will have like slightly different porosity. They'll have different characteristics that when toasted, it gives them slightly different, tastes or smells. Even when they're toasted identically, the wood and the forest themselves has a bearing on the final product. So you can totally go deep in that if you want. But then there's other European oaks, especially Hungarian, and it's the same oak species. Generally, there's a couple, or there's like 2 or 3 really in France, but the same oak species that just grows in Hungary, and so Hungary also makes a lot of what is ultimately like the same French oak, but it's going to taste different. It grows differently in Hungary. It has different porosity, and then people know of American oak that's actually made from a different species than the European oak. So we have white oaks here, which is what's generally used, and Oregon also has white oaks are native to Oregon. But the American oak, it's a much looser grain, and so this allows for more oxygen even than in the newer French oak. I mentioned that the newer barrels have more than the older barrels. Well, American oak has even more than French oak, and then this also means that American oak allows more of those flavor compounds to soak into the wine. So it's kind of considered maybe a little more aggressive than French oak. And I would love I love the concept of using an American grown oak for our neutral barrels. But if we did that, I don't even know how old those barrels would have to be before an American oak would actually get neutral. I don't even know if American oak can get neutral. Like you'd probably have cracked staves, and you'd probably have to get rid of that barrel for some other reason before an American oak barrel actually got to neutrality, where it was not fundamentally altering the flavors of the wine in it. So I like that concept, but that's why we generally use other people's barrels that they've used for a while. So we're still reusing, but we don't source that locally. But I can understand why people would. But there are other types of wood that can make barrels too, and that's what I wanted to talk about now, specifically acacia. Although I've been intrigued by chestnut because chestnut has been historically used in the Rhone, and there are coopers that make chestnut, but I would never be able to get a neutral chestnut barrel, I can tell you that. And I've never used it, and I understand that that's possibly even more porous than American oak, so it could be difficult. But acacia I do like, and with acacia it's kind of confusing. I've tried to ask about this more, but there are literally thousands of different genera and species that are all called acacia. So as far as I can tell, there's just not one acacia tree that people use to make anything from acacia. So acacia aren't native to Europe. They were introduced in the 1600s, and they took all different routes of getting there. They're more native to more tropical, subtropical areas, Africa, Australia, things like that. And so I'm not, it's hard to tell what acacia is actually being used. But what I do know is that the acacia barrels that I've used in the past, what they seem to do is they really elevate or promote floral characteristics in wine. But then they also have a texture effect. I said, we'll be coming back to texture a lot, but with acacia, it almost also increases the viscosity of the wine. And so the floral with the texture, it also adds some, this keeps dinging. I wonder if that comes through as soon as next year. But gum arabic is one of the 100 some odd allowed wine additives. But gum arabic comes from acacia trees. It's also used. You may have seen it in other ingredients lists for other foods. It's used as thickeners and emulsifiers and stuff, and in frostings and some baked goods and things like that. So it's there's nothing too scary about it as an ingredient. It's just I'm annoyed that it does not have to be listed on wine labels. But we don't use any additives at Troon. But the gum arabic that's used in a concentrated form as a wine additive, it's extracted from the acacia, and it does have a textural element to it. So that it's kind of no surprise to me that acacia barrels have a similar, although much less intense effect on the wine. And so I think that textural element's probably related to that. But at Troon, I only have a couple of acacia barrels, and I use them exclusively for our orange or amber wines. So skin fermented Viognier and Vermentino in particular, and also we used to have the Riesling, skin fermented Riesling in them, and that I guess what all those have in common, and what I've found works so well with acacia, is they are all known to have, they're all relatively aromatic. They also have a lot of floral characteristics, certainly in the white varieties of those grapes. So this is what I think acacia does really well, is that supporting or uplifting those floral characteristics, and then that textural element of acacia seems to play really nicely with amber wines. So these amber wines, are fermented on their skins. They already have a lot of texture coming from the skin tannins of the grapes, and that skin tannin texture seems to integrate really nicely with what the acacia barrel offers. So I think it's a really great mix to store age amber wines in acacia barrels. And like I said, I only have a couple, so it's in our, for example, our Kubli Bench Amber, acacia maybe probably 5% of the actual wine in that wine was aged in acacia. But even then, it's that little bit of a thumbprint, I think, is a pretty interesting textural element that it can add. And again, all of our acacia barrels are also neutral, so theoretically, that's what they do is supportive rather than certainly overwhelming any particular aspect of the wine. And then in Foudre, Craig, you mentioned Foudre, and so we do have these two large fermentation vessels. It's basically they're like kind of conical. They like taper a little bit, but in general it's just a big cylinder, and it's open topped. So because it's open topped, we can't store any wine in them. There's not like a lid, so we use them for fermentation. And the same concepts that when we were talking about wood for storage, also those concepts are important for fermentation. And the biggest one is that porosity, which allows some oxygen to get through the vessels. These are originally French oak. They're 2007, I believe, is both of those. So they're very neutral at this point. But they still allow oxygen through the vessel. And most of our other red wines are fermented in bins, 1.5 ton bins. In those bins, they're also open topped, so you get oxygen through the top, but not through the sides of the wines, and through the sides of that vessel, I guess I should say. So the same things, talking about reductive varieties, having that oxygen present during fermentation is really helpful. Help with those reductive tendencies, but then also with things like Tannat, which is, we actually sometimes ferment our Tannat with a little bit of Malbec, but that microoxygenation doesn't help just with reductive tendencies, but it can also help with the tannins. Tannat can have pretty monolithic tannins sometimes, and when we ferment our Tannat in the Foudre, even right after pressing off, even that young wine, there's a distinct difference between the tannin texture in the Tannat that has been fermented in Foudre versus the Tannat that's been fermented in our 1.5 ton bins. So those both the shape and the size, they're also 2 ton fermenters, so they're a little bit larger than our regular ferments. That just adds a little more thermal mass, which adds a little more heat. Basically, you've got a little more material fermenting. It generates a little more heat. The wood is also slightly insulating, so you do get a pretty nice temperature curves during your fermentation. It doesn't heat up particularly fast. It keeps a nice stable temperature throughout the ferment. So we've found that both the Tannat as well as some of our reductive varieties, we've used the Foudre with Syrah as well, and those are both really nice matches for using this. And I guess the difference here is that since this is only a fermentation vessel, we transfer the wines after they're pressed off into barrel, but we keep them separate. So the wines that come from that were fermented in the Foudre are kept separate from the wines that were fermented in our 1.5 ton bins, and we get to taste that wine as it evolves in the cellar. And starting on day one and then throughout its entire evolution in the cellar, you can taste differences in particularly the tannin textures based solely off of that fermentation vessel. So that's a good tool for us to have.
So Nate, you'll be working with a wide variety of vessels that include neutral barrels, Foudre, amphora, concrete, and stainless steel. What does it mean to you as a winemaker to have all these options to work with?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring this back to the vineyard again. When we planted our vineyard here, we put a lot of thought into the grape selection. We did soil studies and test pits, and we looked at our climate data, and we really tried to pick the varieties that would grow really well here. That's particularly important to us to have the grape match this place because we don't manipulate our juice chemistry in any way after harvest. So while many wineries will add acid, or they might water back their wine if there was too high of sugars, we don't do that. So we really need to have our grapes balanced in the vineyard because once they're picked, their chemistry is set and we're going to go with it. That same ethos is also present in our winemaking. So because we're not going to manipulate the wine in the cellar, we need to figure out what is the best way to express each variety to its fullest potential. And I mean, I've sometimes said that I don't make the wines I want to make. I make the wines that Troon Vineyard wants to make. So I may have some intuition about what that best path for a certain wine to take may be, but I have to approach that with a very open mind, and you have to experiment to see, like in the winemaking, like what's the best result for that wine? Like, how is that wine most true to itself, and how do I get it there? And I love the fact that in French they use the term élevage. That describes the process of basically raising, élevage, elevating a wine. So, but raising, that's best understood in the same way that like a parent raises a child, right? It's that same concept that a winemaker is raising a wine, élevage. And so I'm a father myself, and I can understand the struggles involved with an endeavor like that. Like, if you try to enforce your will too strongly without paying attention to the hopes and dreams of that child or wine, the result can sometimes be a rebellion against that very thing that you're trying to instill, right? And the pendulum just swings in the other direction. So in the cellar, I think the role of the winemaker is to guide that young wine like through élevage, and that's listening, intently to the needs of that wine and guiding it in a way that it wishes to express itself. So when we talk about wine being made in the vineyard, that's true to the extent that you can't make great wine from mediocre grapes. But there is an art in guiding that wine through its time in the cellar until it's ready for bottling. And somewhere between the vineyard and the bottle is like where something profound can happen if you are attentive enough to let it do just that. And that is what we try to do here. And having all of these tools at our disposal in the winery through different vessels or different techniques, different ways to approach each grape, in hoping to just allow that grape to find the truest, purest expression of itself.
Well, thank you, Nate. It's going to be exciting to see the future for Troon Wines with all these new vessels and new expressions, and I'm really looking forward to the wines you make from them.
I am too, yeah. We will continue our experimentation, and there'll be loads of new things coming online over the years, so yeah, we'll have a lot to talk about for years to come.
We are happy to share this podcast with you from Troon Vineyard, a Demeter biodynamic and regenerative organic certified winery in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We farm like the world depends on it and produce authentic, naturally crafted wines. We will be sharing these in-depth podcasts several times a month. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website at troonvineyard.com and those of the Regenerative Organic Alliance at regenorganic.org and Demeter Biodynamics at demeter-usa.org. Thanks for sharing our voyage to regenerative agriculture with us.